The Tranquil Ascent was a fine ship by Velkari standards. Commander Solis Veth had served aboard her for 11 years, and in those 11 years she had come to love the soft hum of the vessel's twin ion drives, the pale blue glow of the navigation console, the way the crew moved through the narrow corridors with practiced efficiency. The Tranquil Ascent was sleek, fast, and precise, everything a Velkari scout frigate was supposed to be. She was also, as Solis Veth was about to discover, embarrassingly small. It started with a fold point anomaly. The sensors picked it up at 3:47 station time, a gravitational ripple at the edge of the Cathara Nebula, the kind of signature that meant something large had just punched through the fabric of space. Solis Veth was on the bridge in 4 minutes, still pulling her uniform jacket closed, her silver-streaked hair loose around her shoulders. "Report," she said. Her sensor officer, a young male named Drevith, was staring at his console with an expression Solis Veth had never seen on him before. He was not alarmed exactly. He looked more like a man who had opened a door expecting a closet and found an ocean. "Commander," Drevith said carefully, "I'm reading a vessel." "Classification." "Unknown," he paused. "The profile doesn't match any Velkari, Sorathi, or Conclave design. The hull composition is iron ceramic composite with something else layered underneath. I can't identify it. The reactor signature is," he trailed off. "Drevith." "It's large, Commander. The reactor signature is very large." Solis Veth crossed the bridge and looked at the display herself. The contact was still far out, nearly 200,000 kilometers, but the mass reading made her blink. She checked the calibration. The calibration was fine. She checked it again. "Is this correct?" she asked quietly. "3 times verified," Drevith said. The object on her screen massed approximately 400 times more than the Tranquil Ascent. For context, the largest Velkari warship ever constructed, the pride of the hegemony fleet, the dreadnought Unwavering Purpose, massed 60 times more than her frigate. Whatever was out there in the dark near the Cathara Nebula was not a warship by any definition the Velkari understood. It was something else entirely. Solis Veth straightened her jacket. "Hail them." The communication officer, Ensign Petra, opened a broadband channel across all standard frequencies. For 7 seconds, there was nothing but the quiet static of deep space. Then the channel crackled, and a voice came through, warm, unhurried, slightly amused in a way Solis Veth couldn't quite place. "This is Captain Daniel Rourke of the USCS Leviathan, Terran Compact Deep Exploration Division. We're reading your hail. Good morning, or whatever time it is out here. Do you need assistance?" The bridge went completely silent. Not because the voice was threatening, not because the words were hostile. The bridge went silent because of the casual, almost cheerful tone of a crew that had just emerged from a fold point in unknown space and whose first instinct was to ask if anyone needed help. Solis Veth found her voice. "This is Commander Solis Veth of the Velkari Hegemony Scout Frigate Tranquil Ascent. We are on a survey mission. We did not expect to encounter," she paused, choosing her words, "traffic in this region." "Neither did we, honestly," Captain Rourke replied. "Beautiful nebula, though, is that Cathara. We've had it on our charts for a while. Listen, we don't want to intrude on your survey. If you've claimed this region, we can log it and route around. Or, if you're interested, we know a way station about 4 light towers spinward. Gorath 7. Good food, decent docking fees. We were heading there anyway." Solis Veth looked at Drevith. Drevith looked at Solis Veth. Neither of them had words for what was happening. An unknown vessel of incomprehensible size had just appeared out of nowhere and was cheerfully recommending restaurants. "We know of Gorath 7, Solis Veth said. "We would be amenable to traveling in convoy." "Fantastic. We'll go slow, don't want to lose you in the drift." Rourke out. The channel closed. The bridge remained silent for another long moment. Then Drevith, very quietly, pulled up the visual feed. the long-range optical telescope trained on the contact, now resolving into something more than a mass reading. The image that filled the screen made several crew members take an involuntary step backward. The Leviathan was not shaped like a warship. It had none of the angular aggression of a Valkyrie cruiser, none of the sleek predatory lines of a Sorathi destroyer. It was shaped, more than anything, like a city that someone had decided to launch into space. Massive structural towers rose along its dorsal spine. Entire sections of its hull were lit from within, glowing like a living thing. Its engine array, 4 enormous drives arranged in a square configuration, burned with a blue-white light that outshone the nearby stars. Along its side, in letters that the Tranquil Ascents telescope could resolve from 200,000 kilometers away, because the letters were each several hundred meters tall, were the words, USCS Leviathan. Solis Veth sat down slowly in her command chair. "Get me a secure channel to Hegemony Command," she said. "Priority 1, she paused, "and someone find out what a Terran compact is." Outside the viewport, the Leviathan began to move, slowly, ponderously, with the unhurried grace of something that had never once in its existence needed to be afraid of anything in the dark between the stars. The Tranquil Ascent fell in beside it, or rather, beside a small portion of it. They flew next to what Drevith later calculated was roughly the vessel's midsection, somewhere between the 43rd and 47th decks of what the human manifest would later reveal was a 212-deck vessel. Solis Veth stared out the viewport for a long time. In 11 years aboard the Tranquil Ascent, she had seen neutron stars and binary systems, and the ruins of dead civilizations scattered across the void. She had thought herself a person of considerable composure. She was reconsidering that assessment. Gorath 7 had seen stranger things than a new species. Or so its station master, a leathery old Sorathi named Grevak, told himself as the Leviathan's approach vector appeared on his traffic control console. He told himself this repeatedly. He was still telling himself this when the vessel's mass reading crashed his station's sensor array for the first time, and again when it crashed it a second time after he rebooted it, and a third time when his senior controller quietly suggested that perhaps the array wasn't malfunctioning. Perhaps the reading was simply correct. 400,000 tons of warship Gorath 7 could handle. 1,000,000 tons, even. The station had docking clamps rated for vessels up to 3 kilometers in length. Grevak had been proud of those clamps. He'd commissioned them himself 12 years ago, after a particularly embarrassing incident with an oversized Valkyrie or hauler. The Leviathan was 19 kilometers long. "Tell them," Grevak said to his controller, in the flat voice of a man rapidly revising his understanding of the universe, "that we cannot accommodate them in the standard berths." His controller relayed this message. The human response came back almost immediately, cheerful and entirely unsurprised. "No worries, we'll anchor in open space. We'll send shuttles. Do you have a bay that can handle a Class 4 shuttle?" Grevak checked. A Class 4 human shuttle, according to the specs the Leviathan transmitted, was 80 meters long and displaced roughly the same mass as a Valkyrie corvette. "Bay 7, he said faintly. "Tell them Bay 7. By the time the first human shuttle docked, word had spread through every corridor of Gorath 7. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Off-duty soldiers crowded the observation decks. 3 separate Sorathi intelligence officers who happened to be aboard the station, coincidentally, they would all insist later, pressed themselves against the observation glass alongside everyone else and said nothing, which was deeply out of character. The shuttle that eased into Bay 7 was enormous by any standard except, apparently, human ones. It was blocky and utilitarian, its hull scorched by re-entry from some distant atmosphere, its running lights blinking slowly in the rhythm of a vessel at rest. When the docking clamps engaged and the airlock cycled, the crowd outside Bay 7's observation window held its breath. The humans who walked out looked, disconcertingly, ordinary. There were 12 of them in the first delegation, 8 crew, 2 engineers, and 2 individuals in civilian clothes who turned out to be a xenobiologist and a linguist. They were various heights, various builds, various shades of skin. They looked around the docking bay with open, unguarded curiosity, the way tourists look at a market they've never visited before. One of them, a tall woman with close-cropped hair and a tablet in her hand, immediately crouched down to examine the deck plating, muttered something appreciative about the alloy composition, and made a note. Captain Daniel Rourke was easy to identify. He was not the largest of the group, nor the most formally dressed, but he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who are used to making decisions in difficult moments. He was perhaps 50 years old by the Volcari estimate, with gray at his temples and laugh lines at the corners of his eyes. He shook Grevak's hand. Humans, it turned out, had a greeting ritual involving the clasping of right hands, and smiled. "Hell of a station," Rourke said, looking up at the vaulted ceiling of Bay 7. "How old is it?" 340 years, Grevak said, slightly dazed. "Beautiful, they built things to last back then." He glanced back toward the outer viewport, where the Leviathan hung in space beyond the station's superstructure, blotting out a section of stars. "We try to do the same." That sentence would be quoted in 11 different intelligence reports, filed over the next 72 hours. The humans moved through Gorath 7 like benign disruptions. They were polite aggressively, almost exhaustingly polite. They asked permission before examining anything, apologized when they accidentally blocked corridors, and paid for everything in a compact currency that, when Grevak's accountant converted it, turned out to be worth considerably more than the listed prices. They left tips. Nobody on Gorath 7 had ever left tips before because the concept hadn't existed there until that day. But the questions followed them everywhere. At the market stalls, at the fuel exchange, at the small bar near the station's hub where off-duty Volcari officers nursed their drinks and tried not to stare. How big is the Leviathan? How many crew? How many ships does the compact have? It was Ensign Petra, Solis Veth's young communications officer, who had attached herself to the Volcari diplomatic observer team with the shameless curiosity of someone who knows they are witnessing history, who asked the question that haunted the station for days afterward. She found herself standing near one of the human engineers, a broad-shouldered man named Tors who was inspecting the fuel exchange manifold with professional interest. She asked him, trying to sound casual, how large the biggest human vessel was. Tors thought about it, scratched his jaw. "Depends on how you categorize them," he said. "The colony arcs are bigger than the military ships. The endless horizon, that's an arc, is about 60 kilometers stem to stern, carries about 4 million people." Petra stared at him. 4 million, she repeated. "Give or take, they're basically cities, mobile ones." He shrugged the way people shrug about things that seem normal to them. "Earth gets crowded, people like to have options." Petra walked back to Commander Solis Veth in silence, sat down beside her at a small table overlooking the docking bay, and stared at the shuttle outside, the shuttle that was itself larger than a corvette. "Commander," she said. "I heard," Solis Veth said. They sat in silence for a while, watching the humans move through the station, friendly and curious and entirely unaware that they had just casually detonated every strategic assumption the Volcari hegemony had built over the last 2 centuries. Outside, through the station's main observation window, the Leviathan hung in the dark, patient and vast and brilliantly lit, like a second sun that had decided to stop and rest. The intelligence report landed on High Arbiter Ven's desk at 600 on a Tuesday, and by 6:10 he had read it twice and poured himself a drink, which was not something he normally did before noon. The report had been compiled by the hegemony's Outer Intelligence Division, a group of analysts who were, by professional requirement, difficult to surprise. Their job was to know things before other people knew them, to anticipate, to prepare. They had predicted the Sorathi border skirmishes 3 years before they happened. They had identified the Kelith cartel's smuggling network from a single, anomalous fuel purchase. They were good at their jobs. They had not predicted humans. The report was titled, with uncharacteristic directness, "On the Terran Compact, a preliminary assessment of scale, capability, and intent." It ran to 400 pages. High Arbiter Venn, who had been in politics for 30 years and had developed a finely tuned instinct for when a document contained something that was going to change his life, read the executive summary first and then went back to the beginning and read every word. The Terran Compact, the analysts had determined, was approximately 300 years old as an interstellar civilization, young, by galactic standards, barely past the crawling stage. They had achieved fold space travel comparatively recently. Their territory, as best the intelligence division could map it, covered a region of roughly 40 light-years in diameter, centered on a star called Sol in human records. In 300 years, they had colonized 62 worlds. The Velkari, in 800 years of interstellar travel, had colonized 31. The analysts had flagged this discrepancy. They had flagged it extensively in bold text with 3 separate footnotes. They had also flagged the methodology. Humans did not colonize slowly and carefully, establishing small outposts and building infrastructure over generations. Humans colonized the way they apparently built ships, by over-engineering from the start. A human colony ship didn't carry a few hundred pioneers. It carried millions of people, preloaded with everything needed to build a civilization from scratch: factories, hospitals, libraries, agricultural systems. The colony arcs were not ships in any conventional sense. They were seeds, enormous, armored, self-sufficient seeds that humans dropped onto promising worlds and watched grow. Venn paused at the section on military vessels and read it very carefully. The Compact's warship design philosophy, the analysts explained, was rooted in something that appeared almost paradoxical from the outside. Their ships were massive not because humans were aggressive, but because they were paranoid. The psychological profile section, contributed by a Velkari cultural researcher who had spent 6 months studying human historical records, described a species that had evolved on a world that actively tried to kill them. Not metaphorically, literally. Earth's weather systems could flatten cities. Its tectonic activity could swallow coastlines. Its oceans covered 70% of its surface and contained creatures that had evolved over millions of years to be efficient killing machines. Humans had looked at this environment and their response, culturally and psychologically, had been to refuse to accept it. They built walls against the weather and then built them thicker. They dug foundations deeper than necessary. They engineered redundancies into their redundancies. When they went to space, they took this philosophy with them. A Velkari warship was built to be effective. A human warship was built to survive things that should not be survivable, and then to keep fighting. The armor specifications alone occupied 12 pages of the report. The Leviathan's outer hull was composed of 7 distinct layers: an ablative ceramic top coat, a reactive nanocomposite mesh, a titanium carbide structural layer, an electromagnetic dampening grid, a secondary structural layer, a pressurized damage control system, and an innermost layer the analysts could not fully identify from sensor data but speculated was some form of regenerative material. The total thickness of the hull at its thickest point was 47 meters. 47 meters of armor. Venn set down his drink. The hegemony's most powerful ship-mounted weapon, the MK Roman 7 Lance cannon, the thing they brought out when they needed to end arguments permanently, could penetrate 12 meters of equivalent material before losing effectiveness. He read that section again. Then he opened his desk drawer and poured a second drink. The report's conclusion was carefully, professionally worded, in the measured language of people who understood that what they wrote would be read by powerful people, and that causing a panic was not helpful. But the conclusion was clear. The Terran Compact was not a threat in the aggressive sense. There was no evidence of expansionist military doctrine, no records of unprovoked conflict, no indication that humanity was building toward conquest. Their ships were large because their ships had always been large. Their colonies were numerous because humans were numerous and restless, and could not seem to stop moving. The question, the one that kept appearing in footnotes and margin annotations throughout the 400-page document, was not are they dangerous? The question was, what happens if someone makes them angry? High Arbiter Venn closed the report. He looked out his office window at the pale sky of the hegemony homeworld, at the neat rows of government buildings, at the small personal transports moving in orderly lines between them. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday morning. Everything was completely different. He pressed the calm button on his desk. "Get me the council," he said. "All of them today." His assistant's voice came back, slightly startled. "All of them, sir. Some are off-world." "All of them," Venn said. "Tell them it's important." He paused. "Tell them we've made a new friend, and that we should be very, very careful to stay that way." Diplomatic dinner aboard Gorath 7 was Ambassador Thessaly Morrow's idea, and she had suggested it with the particular calm efficiency that characterized everything she did, a calm that her staff privately referred to as the stillness before the carefully planned storm. Thessaly Morrow was 63 years old, a career diplomat who had spent 4 decades navigating the complex, frequently hostile political landscape of humanity's 62 colonies. She had negotiated trade agreements, resolved border disputes, talked down 3 separate colonial governors who had decided unilaterally that independence was a good idea, and once spent 11 days on a disabled ore hauler in the outer belt, subsisting on protein rations and rainwater while waiting for rescue. She was not a person who was easily unsettled. She was, however, a person who did her homework. By the time she sat down across from High Arbiter Venn at the long table in Gorath 7 diplomatic suite, she had read every piece of publicly available Velkari cultural and political literature her team could compile, briefed herself on hegemony political structure, reviewed Commander Solis Veth's reported reactions during the first encounter, and identified, with the instinctive precision of someone who had spent decades reading rooms, exactly what question the Velkari most needed answered. They were afraid, not of an attack, of being left behind, of irrelevance, of discovering that the galaxy had a new kind of player and that everything they thought they understood about power and scale needed to be revised. She knew this because she'd read the look on Solis Veth's face in the written report. She'd seen that look before, on colonial governors when a new transport route made their world a backwater, on trade ministers when a better resource deposit was discovered 3 systems over. It was the look of someone recalculating their position in a universe that had just shifted under their feet. So she let Venn ask the question he'd been building toward for the first 40 minutes of dinner. Through the polite small talk about trade routes and the careful discussion of conclave membership procedures, and the methodical, circling approach of a politician who had also done his homework. And when he finally leaned forward and said, with the bluntness of someone who had decided that directness was less dangerous than dancing any longer around the subject, "Ambassador Morrow, why do your people build ships of such extraordinary size?" She was ready. She set down her fork. She took a small sip of water, and she told him the truth because she had found in 40 years of diplomacy that the truth was almost always more effective than any alternative. "High Arbiter," she said, "have you ever studied Earth's history, our home planet?" Venn indicated that he had reviewed summaries. She nodded. "Then you know it's a violent world. Seismically, meteorologically, biologically, it is a planet that is actively, constantly hostile to organized life." She paused. "In the last 5,000 years of recorded human history, our civilization has been nearly destroyed 14 times. Plagues that killed half the global population. Volcanic events that blocked out the sun for years. Wars that we started ourselves, which, I'll be honest with you, is something we're working on. Ice ages. Asteroid impacts, supervolcanoes. Ven was very still, and yet you survived. And yet we survived, Thessaly agreed. Do you know what the survivors had in common every single time? She didn't wait for an answer. They had built more than they needed. The villages that stored 3 times the food they expected to need survived the famine. The cities that built walls twice as thick held when the others fell. The nations that dug their foundations deeper kept their buildings standing when the earthquake came. She picked up her fork again. We don't build large ships because we think we're going to need them to conquer someone. We build large ships because somewhere, deep in the part of our brain that's been keeping us alive for 100,000 years, there is a voice that says, the universe will try to destroy what you make. And the only answer to that voice that has ever worked is, build it bigger than necessary. Ven was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the dinner continued, aides talking quietly, food being brought and taken away. Somewhere at the far end of the table, one of Thessaly's junior diplomats was laughing at something a Velkari cultural attaché had said. So the size is defensive, Ven said slowly. Fundamentally, yes. She smiled, not a diplomatic smile, a genuine one. We're not trying to intimidate anyone, High Arbiter. We're just very, very used to assuming that something will go wrong and trying to be ready for it. Ven looked at her for a long moment. Then, carefully, he picked up his own fork and turned it over in his long fingers, examining it the way a man examines something when he's actually thinking about something else. Your Leviathan, he said, the hull thickness, the redundant systems, the armor. He glanced up. Your engineers did not build that ship expecting to use it. Captain Rourke would be deeply offended if anyone started a fight he couldn't finish, Thessaly said. But no, he built it, we built it, hoping never to have to use most of it. And if someone forced your hand? Thessaly Morrow put down her fork for the second time. She looked at him directly, and her voice, when she spoke, was not unkind. But it was the voice of someone who had spent decades saying true things that needed to be said. High Arbiter, she said, we haven't shown you our warships yet. The Leviathan is an exploration vessel. She let that sit in the air between them for a moment. We would very much like to be friends. We are, as a species, trying very hard to be the kind of people who choose friendship first. Another pause. I suggest we both make sure that continues to be the easier option. The dinner ended warmly, with agreements to reconvene and preliminary discussions about compact observer status at the conclave. Ven walked back to his quarters with his aide, who waited until they were alone to say what was on both their minds. She was polite about it, the aide said. Yes, Ven said. But she was also telling us something. Yes, Ven said again. She was. He was quiet for a moment. Make sure the council understands. We are going to be very good friends with the Terran Compact. We are going to be the very best friends we are capable of being. The aide nodded. And if the Sorathi don't feel the same way? High Arbiter Ven thought about 47 meters of layered armor. He thought about colony arcs 60 kilometers long carrying 4 million people. He thought about a species that had survived 14 near-extinction events and responded each time by building something bigger. Then that, he said quietly, will be the Sorathi's problem. Warlord Kasich of the Sorathi frontier clans had not achieved his position by being cautious. In 30 years of frontier warfare, against rival clans, against Velkari border patrols, against the occasional pirate collective that had mistaken his territory for easy pickings, Kasich had learned a single governing principle. The universe respected strength, and strength was measured in ships. He had 41 warships. Most frontier commanders had fewer than 20. This made him, in his estimation, approximately twice as correct about everything as anyone else in the region. The new species was, by his intelligence, young and inexperienced. They had appeared from somewhere beyond the explored rim. They had sent a single vessel to Gorath 7. They had attended diplomatic dinners and smiled politely, and they had claimed a colony world on the edge of what Kasich had long privately considered his expansion territory. The world was called, in human designation, Kepler 882c. It was mineral-rich and strategically positioned at the mouth of a fold corridor that would open up 3 unexplored systems. Kasich wanted it. He was not, strictly speaking, planning a military strike. He was planning a demonstration of interest, 30 warships holding station at a respectful but unambiguous distance while his ambassador delivered a formal request for territorial reassessment. It was the kind of message that, in his experience, new civilizations understood clearly. You are new here, we are established here, let us discuss terms that favor us appropriately. He had sent 30 ships because 30 felt decisive. He had not sent 41 because that felt like it might be interpreted as hostile. He had not, at any point in his planning, considered what the human response might look like, because in his experience, new civilizations did not have robust military responses to frontier pressure. They negotiated. That was the point. The compact's response arrived in the Kepler 882c system 6 standard days after Kasich's fleet dropped out of fold space and took up position. It came as a single contact on the long-range sensors, a fold point signature much larger than anything Kasich's sensor operator had seen before. He assumed it was a malfunction and had the system recalibrated. The second reading matched the first. The USCS immovable resolve emerged from fold space, with the slow, inexorable patience of something that had never once needed to hurry. It did not rush. It did not accelerate aggressively or angle toward the Sorathi fleet with weapons hot. It simply appeared, the way a mountain appears when morning fog clears, and began moving at a calm, unhurried pace toward a position between the Sorathi fleet and the colony world. Kasich's bridge fell silent. His sensor operator, a veteran of 30 years who had seen everything worth seeing on the frontier, read the data off his console in a voice stripped of all inflection. Length, 26 kilometers. Displacement, classified, sensor array insufficient. Hull temperature, nominal, implying the vessel was running at low power. Weapons signature, multiple emplacements detected, none active. Crew complement, estimated 40,000. 40,000. Kasich's flagship, the Sovereign Fist, the ship he was proudest of, the symbol of his power on the frontier, carried a crew of 800. He stared at the image resolving on the main view screen. The immovable resolve was not shaped like a warship. It was shaped like a verdict. Its hull was dark and massive, studded with weapons emplacements the size of small buildings, layered in armor that caught the light of Kepler 882 star and gave nothing back. Along its flanks ran running lights in the compact's colors, white and deep blue, blinking with slow, steady indifference. It positioned itself between his fleet and the colony world with the casual ease of someone pulling up a chair, and then it stopped. And then it waited. For 47 seconds, nothing happened. Kasich's bridge crew looked at him. He looked at the resolve. The resolve said nothing, did nothing, pointed nothing at anyone. It simply existed with a completeness and finality that made everything else in the system feel temporary. Then a channel opened. The voice that came through was female, measured, and carrying the particular quality of someone who is making an effort to be polite because they were raised to be polite, and not because the situation requires it. This is Captain Yara Chen of the USCS Immovable Resolve. I'm reading 30 Sorathi vessels in close proximity to a Terran compact colonial territory. I want to assume this is a navigation error, because the alternative is that 30 ships came to bother 400,000 civilians, and I'd rather not believe that about anyone. A pause. Is everyone okay out there? Do you need assistance finding your way back to the fold corridor? Nobody on Kasich's bridge spoke. He had prepared for threats. He had prepared for demands, for ultimatums, for the standard vocabulary of territorial confrontation. He had not prepared for a 26-kilometer warship, asking him if he was lost in the same tone a teacher uses with a student who has shown up to the wrong classroom. His communications officer looked at him. His tactical officer looked at him. His second-in-command, a hard-faced female named Vora who had never, in his memory, looked uncertain about anything, looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her before. He looked at the immovable resolve. He looked at his 30 ships. He did the mathematics that he should have done before he left port, in the cold, an honest part of his brain that he usually kept quiet because it interfered with ambition. His 30 ships could not scratch that hull, not collectively, not if they fired everything they had simultaneously and kept firing for a week. "Plot a course back to the Fold Corridor," he said. His voice came out steady, which he was proud of. "Sir," his navigator said. "We're leaving," Kasich said. "Navigation error. Log it as a navigation error." As his fleet turned, Captain Chen's voice came through one final time, pleasantly. "Safe travels. The Fold Corridor exit is about 3 light towers spinward. Watch for the drift current on the approach. It'll push you about 2 degrees off heading if you're not compensating. Resolve out." Kasich sat in his command chair and watched his view screen until the immovable resolve had shrunk to a point of light. Then he called in his senior staff, and for the first time in 30 years of frontier command, said 4 words that did not come naturally to him. "Brief me on humans." The journalist's name was Sira Voss, and she had been told by every senior colleague she respected that the assignment was too dangerous, too speculative, and almost certainly a dead end. She had accepted it anyway, because Sira Voss had built her career on dead ends that turned out to be roads. She was Velkari, 41 years old, a senior correspondent for the Hegemony Broadcasting Collective, who had covered the Sorathi border skirmishes, the Keleth cartel collapse, and the political restructuring of the inner worlds with a combination of meticulous research and the kind of instinct for significance that could not be taught in any school. When High Arbiter Ven's office had quietly let slip that the Terran Compact had extended a press access invitation, the first ever offered to a non-human journalist, Sira had submitted her application within the hour. 2 months later, she was on a human shuttle descending toward Callisto Station. Callisto, she had been briefed, was a moon of Jupiter, the largest planet in the Sol system, a gas giant so massive it had almost been a star. The humans, characteristically, had looked at this moon and decided to build a shipyard on it. Not a small shipyard, not a modest industrial facility. The largest ship construction complex in human space, which, as Sira was increasingly understanding, meant something different when applied to humans than it did when applied to any other species. The shuttle broke through a thin atmospheric processing layer, and the yards came into view, and Sira Voss, who had once calmly filed a report while standing 300 meters from an active artillery exchange, gripped her seat harness and stopped breathing for several seconds. The scaffolding alone was visible from orbit. It rose from Callisto's surface in towers that made the moon's own geography look modest, frameworks of steel and composite material stretching tens of kilometers into the sky, lit at every level with the blue-white flicker of welding operations, crawling with automated systems and suited human workers who, at this distance, were invisible to the naked eye and only resolvable through her camera's maximum zoom as tiny moving specks. The yards covered an area roughly the size of a small continent. The infrastructure required to support them, power generation, materials processing, crew habitation, logistics networks, formed an entire secondary city at the scaffolding's base. And inside the scaffolding, cradled in those enormous frameworks like ships in bottles, surrounded by work platforms and delivery systems, and the organized chaos of industrial construction at scale, were the hulls. There were 11 of them in various stages of completion. 3 were clearly military, the angular, heavily armored profiles she had come to recognize from the Leviathan and the immovable Resolve, though these were visibly larger. 2 were ore processors, purely industrial vessels the size of small towns, and six enormous shapes that dwarfed everything else, that dwarfed the military vessels the way the military vessels dwarfed Valkyrie warships, were arcs. Colony arcs under construction, each one, at its current stage, already longer than 40 kilometers. Her guide was a human named Chief Engineer Priya Okonkwo, a compact woman in her 50s with engineering grease permanently embedded in the lines of her hands, and the specific kind of focus that belongs to people who build things for a living. She walked Sira through the yards with the proprietary pride of someone showing off a beloved project, explaining construction schedules, hull specifications, propulsion systems, life support capacity. Sira recorded everything and asked questions at every turn because the questions mattered. How long to build one of the arcs? This generation, about 12 years per ship, Okonkwo said. And they carry 4 million people each. Depends on configuration. Standard residential is around 4 million. High density is closer to 6. We're experimenting with modular expansion systems on the Mark 7. If the tests work, theoretical capacity on the new design is closer to 9 million. She said this the way someone says we're trying a new recipe, interested, pleased about the possibility, completely unbothered by the scale. Where are they going? Sira asked. Okonkwo pointed, not at anything specific, just outward toward the wall of the facility and whatever lay beyond it. Further, she said simply, there's a lot of galaxy out there, we've barely started. Sira spent 4 days at Callisto Station. She interviewed engineers and logistics officers and a young crew trainee who was excited to be assigned to one of the new arcs. She watched, from an observation deck, as a section of hull plating the size of a city block was moved into position by automated systems and welded into place. She filed daily reports, each one carefully within the bounds of her press agreement with the compact, each one setting off fresh rounds of emergency briefings in the hegemony government. On her last day, she asked Okonkwo the question she had been saving. How many ships does the compact have? Total fleet, all classes. Okonkwo looked at her steadily for a moment. I can't give you classified military numbers, she said. I'm not asking about military ships specifically, Sira said. All ships, colonial, civilian, commercial, military, everything registered under the compact. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out her tablet, navigated to a database, and turned it so Sira could see the screen. Sira looked at the number. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned off her recording equipment, because she had made a professional judgment in that moment that some information required time to process before it could be responsibly communicated. She thanked Okonkwo, returned to her quarters, and sat on her bunk in silence for approximately 40 minutes. Her report, when it was filed, was comprehensive and carefully written, and contained a great deal of valuable information about human construction methodology and colonial expansion philosophy. It did not contain the number from the tablet. She was asked about this later by her editor. It was accurate, her editor said, the number. Yes, Sira said. And you chose not to report it. I chose, Sira said carefully, to give people time to get comfortable with everything else first. Her editor looked at her for a long moment. That bad? Sira Voss, who had covered wars and collapses, and the full width of Valkyrie political catastrophe without blinking, thought about the number on that tablet. It's not bad, she said. They're not hostile, it's just, she searched for the right word, it's a lot of ships. Conclave Summit had been scheduled for 3 days. It ran for 9. This was not unusual for conclave summits. The 6-species gathering had a long tradition of optimistic scheduling and comprehensive overruns, but the reason for the extension this time was unprecedented. On the second day, during a routine review of navigational records submitted as part of the compact's application for observer status, A junior Sorathi analyst named Hevek made a discovery that cascaded upward through the diplomatic delegations, with the speed and effect of a very large stone dropped into a very still pond. The discovery was this: the Terran compact's submitted star charts were the most comprehensive navigational records anyone in the conclave had ever seen. This was, on its surface, unremarkable. New members often contributed chart data as a diplomatic gesture, and chart coverage was a standard measure of a civilization's exploratory reach. The remarkable part was the extent of the compact's coverage. When the human charts were overlaid against the combined conclave navigational database, the collective output of 6 civilizations covering between 200 and 800 years of space travel, the human charts filled gaps that no one had known existed. They mapped systems beyond the furthest Valkyrie exploration marker. They charted fold corridors that the Sorathi had theorized but never confirmed. They contained detailed surveys of regions that every other species had simply not gotten to yet. The human charts did not cover more territory than the combined conclave database. They covered more than twice as much. High Arbiter Vin called an emergency recess on the 3rd day, pulling all 6 delegations, and the compact's ambassador Morrow, into a smaller conference room for what was euphemistically described as a technical clarification session. He placed the overlay on the central display. He let everyone look at it. Then he turned to Thessaly Morrow and asked, with the careful calm of someone who had spent the last several weeks rebuilding his working model of the universe, how long humans had been mapping the galaxy. Thessaly looked at the display, then she looked at him. "How long have we had fold space capability?" she asked. "Our records suggest approximately 300 years, Ven said. 312, she confirmed. "We started mapping immediately." She paused. "We like maps, we like knowing what's out there. It's," she considered, "a cultural trait." A Sorathi elder named Counselor Dreven, who had been in interstellar politics for 60 years and had developed a nearly infinite capacity for professional composure, looked at the overlay for a long moment and then said, very quietly, "You've been out there this whole time." "Yes," Thessaly said. "And you never announced yourselves." "We were waiting until we were ready," she said it simply, without apology. "We had a lot of internal work to do first, colonies to establish, infrastructure to build, political consolidation." A small, slightly rueful smile. "We're not always easy to organize as a species. We had to get our house in order before we knocked on anyone else's door." "And now you're ready," Dreven said. "Now we're ready." The room was quiet. On the display, the human charts glowed over the void of unexplored space. Thousands of surveyed systems, hundreds of mapped fold corridors, the skeleton of a galactic understanding built quietly and patiently over 3 centuries, while the established civilizations of the conclave had assumed they were alone in their corner of space. It was Commander Solis Veth, attending as a military observer, the same officer who had first encountered the Leviathan at the Cathara Rim, who asked the question that had been building in the room since the overlay went up. "How many of those surveyed systems have you visited personally?" she asked. "Ships on the ground, crew on the surface." Thessaly looked at the chart. She did a quiet calculation. "About 60%, she said. "The rest are long-range survey data. We haven't put crews on those yet." Solis Veth looked at 60% of an enormous map. "You've been busy," she said. "We don't like sitting still," Thessaly agreed. What followed was not a crisis exactly, but it was a thorough and extended revision of assumptions. Over the next 6 days, the 6 extra days that turned a 3-day summit into a 9-day event, the conclave's delegations worked through the implications with the focused intensity of people who understand that the rules of the game have changed, and who are determined to understand the new rules before committing to any particular course of action. The human charts were formally incorporated into the conclave navigation database. the first time any non-member species had contributed to that database. The compact's observer status was upgraded, provisionally, to associate membership. 3 separate bilateral agreements were initiated, one between the Velkari and the compact on fold corridor sharing, one between the Sorathi, who had, quietly and without fanfare, replaced Kasek's frontier command structure with more diplomatically inclined personnel, on territorial boundaries, and one between all 6 conclave species, and the compact on mutual exploration protocols for the unmapped regions. On the 8th day, High Arbiter Ven found himself sitting beside Solis Veth at a late evening reception, both of them looking out at the stars through Gorath 7 main observation window, both of them holding drinks and not saying very much. They had known each other for years. She was one of his most trusted field officers, and they had developed the particular comfort of people who can sit in silence together and not find it strange. After a while, Ven said, "When you first saw the Leviathan at Kithara, what did you feel?" Solis Veth considered this. "Small," she said, "then curious, then something I didn't have a name for at the time." She paused. "I think the name for it is relief." Ven looked at her. "We've been exploring for 800 years, she said, "and for a long time we thought we were alone. Then we found the other conclave species and that helped, but the galaxy is so large and we are so few." She turned her glass in her hands. "When I saw that ship, that enormous, absurd, extraordinary ship, I thought, we are not alone out here. There is something else, something that built that." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know yet whether that was a good thing, but it was not nothing." Ven nodded slowly. Outside, the stars burned with ancient patience. "Tomorrow," he said, "we vote on full membership." "I know," Solis Veth said. "I'll be there." They sat in silence a little longer, 2 people from a civilization that had spent 8 centuries looking at the dark and wondering what was in it, sitting on the edge of an answer that was larger and stranger, and, so far, considerably friendlier than anyone had dared to hope. The morning of the vote, it rained on Gorath 7. This was unusual. The station's atmospheric processors maintained a climate of careful, consistent neutrality, mild temperature, low humidity, no precipitation. Rain was not supposed to happen. But something in the condensation system had misfired overnight, and by 700, a fine mist was falling from the station's upper atmospheric layer onto the commercial district, beating on market awnings and collecting in the joints of the docking bay superstructure, and generally causing Grevek, the station master, to have an irritable morning as his maintenance teams tracked down the fault. Ambassador Thessaly Morrow thought it was wonderful. She stood on the small balcony outside her quarters and held her hand out into the mist and smiled in a way her staff recognized as the expression of someone who was very far from home and has just encountered something unexpectedly familiar. "It's like Earth," said her junior aide Tamaz, standing in the doorway. "A little," she said. "Is that a good sign?" She considered this. "It's a morning," she said. "Let's go make history." The conclave chamber was a circular room at Gorath 7 political hub, its walls lined with the flags and symbols of the 6-member civilizations, its central table, a massive oval of some ancient dark wood shipped at considerable expense from the Velkari homeworld, surrounded by 60 chairs, 10 per delegation. A 7th set of chairs had been brought in overnight for the compact's delegation. They were slightly different from the others, sourced in a hurry, Thessaly suspected, but nobody mentioned it. The vote itself was brief. Formal membership proposals in the conclave required a majority of 5 of the 6 species to proceed. The preliminary readings suggested the result was not in doubt, but the reading of votes was a ceremony as much as a procedure, and ceremonies mattered. Velkari, yes. Sorathi, yes, delivered with the careful, deliberate enunciation of a delegation that had spent 6 weeks having a very serious internal conversation about this decision. Kelith Cooperative, yes. Rithani Collective, yes. Maveth Federation, yes. Dravani Accord, yes. 6 for 6, unanimous. The chamber erupted, which was not typical for conclave proceedings. Typical conclave proceedings were solemn and measured affairs. But something about the moment, the weeks of tension and discovery and recalibration, the quiet revolution in assumptions, the 9-day summit that had felt less like a diplomatic negotiation and more like the first day of something genuinely new, broke through the professional decorum of 60 diplomats and made them, for a moment, simply people who were glad about something. Thessaly Morrow shook hands with High Arbiter Ven. Then, because she was who she was and could not help it, she pulled him into a brief, firm embrace that made his protocol officers wince, and that Ven, for his part, returned with the slightly awkward sincerity of someone who was not used to being hugged at diplomatic functions, but found, on reflection, that he did not object. "Welcome," he said. "Thank you," she said. "We'll try to be useful." "I have no doubt," he said, and meant it entirely. The signing ceremony took 2 hours, 60 signatures, 6 species, 1 compact. The documents were formal and technical and full of the dense legislative language that turned significant moments into dry reading, but each signature represented something that no amount of phrasing could fully capture. A decision, made by 6 civilizations across millennia of caution and conflict and careful isolation, to let something new in. Afterward, the delegations moved to Gorath 7 main observation deck for the reception. It was still misting faintly. The maintenance team had not yet found the fault, and the mist caught the light from outside and made everything soft-edged and slightly luminous. Solis Veth found a spot near the main viewport, as she had taken to doing at these events. The view was good. The Leviathan was still anchored in open space beyond the station, its running lights patient and steady. Beside it, arrived the previous day to serve as part of the diplomatic escort, was a second human vessel, smaller than the Leviathan but only by compact standards, its hull marked with the designation USCS Perseverance. And now, as the reception began, a fold-point signature bloomed at the edge of sensor range. A third vessel. The fold space exit resolved into another contact that made the station's sensors work hard. Long-range optical picked it up a few seconds later, and the image appeared on the observation deck's secondary display. Another ship, massive and unhurried, settling into a holding position a few hundred kilometers off. The hull markings were too far to read immediately, but the profile was unmistakable. The layered, deliberate, overbuilt architecture of Terran construction. Solis Veth watched it appear, watched it take its place in the dark alongside the others. 3 human ships now, sitting in the space outside Gorath 7 like hills that had decided to visit, their running lights blinking in slow, easy rhythms. She was aware of Ambassador Morrow coming to stand beside her. Thessaly looked at the display, at the new arrival, and something in her expression was quietly pleased. "Were you expecting that one?" Solis Veth asked. "We like to send a proper escort for formal occasions," Thessaly said. 3 felt right. "We noticed the third one when it arrived." "I assumed you would." Thessaly was quiet for a moment, watching the distant lights. "Does it bother you? I want to know, genuinely, if it does." Solis Veth thought about the Kethara rim, and the mass reading that had crashed her sensor array, and the long first night of flying in the shadow of the Leviathan and feeling, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely small. She thought about Drevith's face. She thought about Ensign Petra and Tors and the number 4 million, said casually over a fuel manifold. She thought about 47 meters of armor and star charts that mapped twice the known galaxy, and a dreadnought that asked a fleet of 30 warships if they needed help finding their way home. "No," she said honestly, "it doesn't bother me. It did at first." She paused. "Now it's just," she searched, reassuring. Thessaly looked at her. "You're not afraid of us anymore," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I was never exactly afraid," Solis Veth said. "I was recalibrating." She turned away from the viewport to face the ambassador. There's a difference. Fear is when you see something and think it wants to harm you. What I felt at Cathara was something else. I saw something enormous and I thought, I don't understand what this is yet. And that is always uncomfortable until it isn't. Thessaly Morrow was quiet for a moment. Outside, the three human ships floated in the dark, patient as continents, their lights steady against the ancient, indifferent stars. For what it's worth, the ambassador said finally, we were nervous too. The first time we pointed our ships toward unknown space and sent them out. She paused. We didn't know what we were going to find. We didn't know if anything out here would want to meet us. And now, Solis Veth said. Thessaly smiled, a genuine smile, tired from a long 9 days and warm from a good outcome, and carrying in it the particular quality of someone who has been waiting a long time for something, and has finally, carefully, arrived. Now, she said, we're glad we came. On the observation deck behind them, 60 diplomats from 7 civilizations ate and drank, and talked too loudly and laughed at things that didn't fully translate and tried, with varying success, to pronounce each other's names correctly. Someone, one of the human junior staff, Solis Veth suspected, had found the station's audio system and connected it to a compact music database, and something with a strong rhythm and a great deal of bass was now contributing to the muffled chaos in a way that Grevek the station master would later describe in his log as an incident. The mist continued to fall softly. The ships floated in the dark. And somewhere beyond the edge of everything the conclave had mapped, in the vast unmapped reaches that the human charts described in careful detail, and that no